Careers virtual series. This series seeks to shine a light on conservation professionals and highlight their career journey and also the tools that they use to help them get where they are. And today we have the pleasure of being joined by Corina Newsome. She is a conservation scientist with the National Wildlife Federation, and she is also a good friend. So thank you for joining us today, and please take it away.
Thank you, Kiana and Sheridan. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for joining us. I'm always so excited to share my journey, my story, because I continue, even as an adult who's already working in the field, I continue to learn from other people's stories who have come before me, and I can never get enough of it. So I'm excited to share. And if you have questions about anything that I say or bring up that doesn't, maybe doesn't make sense, or you'd like me to share more about, you can feel free to ask, and I will answer as many questions as possible. So I will go ahead and jump right in, right? And just make sure that you all can see this. All right, great. So as Kiana mentioned, I'm a conservation scientist at the National Wildlife Federation, and my science focus is on, of course, wildlife, based on where I work, as you could probably guess. And I currently live in Atlanta, Georgia, but my work is based in Atlanta as well as Washington, D.C. So I'm able to have both kind of a local focus in the work that I do in the Atlanta area, which is in recent years home for me, as well as a national focus through the work that I do in Washington. So to get started, whenever I have the opportunity to share about my career path, I always like to start from the beginning. This is a note that I wrote to myself, I believe, when I was 4. And my grandma asked me to write down, for the record, what I wanted to do with my life, right? Which is a heavy question to ask a 4-year-old. But the thing is, I knew. So I will translate this for you because the spelling is horrendous. It says, this is what I want to do when I grow up. I want to be an astronaut, which you can ignore because I get very seasick on roller coasters. So space wouldn't be great. But I want to be an astronaut and a scientist. And I want to be a scientist on bugs and animals. And from a very young age, from the beginning, I knew that I loved animals, I loved wildlife. And thankfully, I had a mother and grandmother and father who nurtured that passion. So I was born and raised in Philadelphia, PA, in a pretty urbanized environment. So I didn't have a lot of wildlife that I recognized around me. But more importantly, I didn't have anyone to educate me about the wildlife that was there. So all the wildlife information that I got was through books and TV. So this is one of my favorite materials that I would get my wildlife information from. I would watch a lot of PBS Nature, which I'm not sure if this is, maybe more of my generation than you all's, but got to watch a lot of, got to kind of feed my passion through the information that I was consuming through books and TV. And National Geographic was my absolute favorite magazine and is one of my favorites still to this day. And there were also some really awesome science communicators on TV and shows like The Crocodile Hunter, if you all are familiar with Steve Irwin, or folks like the Kratt brothers. Zumbumafu was my show. That is my lemur. And then like Bill Nye the Science Guy, right, who talked about all kinds of science on his show. And I loved all those shows, and they actually were really skilled at kind of getting kids and adults really excited about wildlife or about science. But the thing that was happening that I didn't realize was happening until I was almost an adult was that the fact that every single person who I was listening to and watching on TV, who were the science experts and the wildlife experts, were all white men. And while there, of course, is nothing wrong with anyone being a science communicator, if you are not seeing yourself represented as an expert, and in my case, if I'm not seeing any Black people or Black women or women at all being the science experts, what happened is that dream that I had as a kid, wanting to be a scientist on bugs and animals, I started to kind of rethink what was possible for me, and I didn't even realize that was happening. So I didn't have any reflection of myself when it comes to experts in this field. And I also didn't really have exposure. Like I said, I didn't have any environmental educators really in my life to kind of show me the way as far as, stoking my interest in the place where I lived. But something fairly miraculous, I think, happened. And at my church in Philly, a friend of the family came up to me one day and he was like, hey, I heard you like animals. My sister works at the zoo, at the Philadelphia Zoo. I'm going to give her your number so she can give you a call. And when he said that, my first thought was, but I want to work with animals. And all the people who I knew worked at the zoo, who were from my own neighborhood and stuff, they all worked, you know, maybe in administration, or they worked in concessions during the summer, but no one worked with animals. And so my assumption was that she couldn't possibly work with animals, right? Because she's from where I'm from. But I was so wrong. It turns out she, and her name is Michelle Jamison, and to this day, she's a mentor of mine. She was actually the lead carnivore keeper at the Philadelphia Zoo, which means she was taking care of the big cats, the other large carnivores. She was breeding endangered species, making, you know, plans for how other people could breed endangered species. She was the top keeper, one of the top keepers at the whole zoo. My mind was blown. And so when I got connected with her, she actually got me an internship at the Philadelphia Zoo. And this is essentially where my career took the turn that got me where I am today. She got me an internship. I had no experience with animals at all. I was 17 at this point. I had never even actually been to the zoo before this internship that I had, and she advocated for me, and I got that internship. And for the next 3 summers, I was working in conservation education, where I was educating the general public about the animals at the zoo. And these pictures are so grainy, it tells you just how long ago these were taken. But, you know, educating about the conservation needs of these animals and why they're so incredible, and just sharing my passion about wildlife. And it changed my life. And I was so grateful, because what turns out to be true is that, you know, when you go to college, and I was just on my way to college when I had this first internship, it's really important to get experience. It's really important to do internships and volunteer, or do programs that get you experience, hands-on experience doing the work that you want to do as a professional. Because once I graduated from college, which I'll get to in a little bit, it turns out by the time you graduate, you need like 3 years of experience to work with wildlife in a zoo setting. I would not have known that had Miss Michelle not gotten me that internship and gotten me the information I need. So I'm sharing that with you all in case you are interested in working with wildlife in an animal care environment, but I'll get into that in a little more detail. And so when I was exposed to all the things that were possible in the world of wildlife conservation, that changed everything for me. And so then I went on to go to college. I went to a school called Malone University in Ohio, Canton, Ohio, where I majored and got a degree in zoo and wildlife biology. And so my education focused a lot on learning about mammals, reptiles, birds, amphibians, learning how to care for a whole diversity of different kinds of animals, from parrots, like you see here, that's a Senegal parrot, to tegus, which are large lizards, to large constrictors like boa constrictors, and even anacondas in some cases, caring for small mammals like sugar gliders and little bitty animals that are very delicate in comparison to some of the larger ones. So I got this large range of both education through my classes, as well as hands-on experience to learn how to take care of animals, because I knew after working at the zoo that first time that I really enjoyed working hands-on with wildlife. And so while I was at the zoo, one of the other things that I found out that I was really passionate about, so in addition to taking care of animals and learning about animals and studying wildlife, I love to share my passion about animals with other people. And so while I was in school, myself, as well as one of my friends there, his name is Jake, we started an outreach education program. So we had a lot of animals at the school that we were using to take care of and kind of practice our animal care techniques with. And we decided to take those out to the community and teach people about the wildlife where they live and the wildlife that we had to share at our school. And that was an absolutely incredible experience, and really locked me into how much I love not only science, but education. And while I was in college, in addition to realizing, man, I love hands-on animal care, I love taking care of wildlife, I love educating people about wildlife, I realized another passion that was a little bit more specific, and that was a passion for ornithology, or the study of birds. And so 2 years before I graduated, or a year before I graduated, I realized that I was obsessed with birds. Do you hear me? And the way this happened, so I was actually, this class, ornithology, that I took, even though I loved wildlife, I was actually dreading this class, because I heard that we had to memorize like 200 birds, like by sight, and we had to memorize like 70 by ear. And I didn't even know that there were that many birds like in North America. Like these were birds that were kind of outside in our backyard that we had to memorize. And I was like, where are there 200 birds, right? Well, fun fact, turns out that almost 1,000 different kinds of birds can be seen across North America at different times of the year. And the first day of that class, my professor put this bird on the screen. He was introducing us to some of the most common birds in the area where we lived in Ohio and kind of the eastern part of the United States. And I could not believe my eyes. Like looking at this bird, all these different blue colors, the white, the black, the striping. I'm like, this lives here? What is that? And people looked at me like I was crazy. They're like, Corina, this is a blue jay, right? And turns out I had heard of blue jays before, but I had never seen a blue jay before. So similar to kind of what Kiana was describing at the beginning, sometimes you can hear birds or hear about birds without ever actually seeing them if you don't know what to look for. Kiana, of course, knows what to look for, but those little parulas she mentioned, they're very good at hiding. But this blue jay, I'd never seen. The moment I left class, I walked outside, looked around, and these birds were everywhere. Somehow, literally, my entire life and my entire, college career, these birds have been singing and squawking and flying around. And I love wildlife, and I didn't even notice them. And that was the point at which I knew I wanted to study birds more. I wanted to learn as much as I could about birds, and I wanted to share birds with other people. Because if it's possible that I was missing how many different beautiful kinds of birds were living around me, imagine what people who maybe don't really think much about wildlife on a daily basis might be missing. And I just could not live with that. So I began to chase birds from that point forward. And that's kind of what led me into these two main dimensions of the first part of my career. And I would say I'm still kind of in the first leg of my career. I'm still fairly young, though not as young as all of you, I'm sure. But the two main focuses that I had were in animal care, as I described a little bit just now, and field biology. And I'll get into field biology in just a second. So after I graduated from college and got my degree again in zoo and wildlife biology, I went on to become a zookeeper, an animal care professional. And I worked at a couple of different zoos, first in Cleveland, Ohio, and then in Nashville. And I worked the longest as an ambassador animal keeper, which means that I was taking care of animals that were interfacing a lot with the public through education programs, on grounds outreach programs, community outreach programs, things like that. And that included hundreds of different species. And it was such an exciting job. And the animal that you're actually seeing here in this picture is called a binturong, or a bear cat, which is a mammal native to Southeastern Asia. And so as part of this work, there were three kind of main components of my job as a zookeeper. And most people, when they think of zookeeping, they probably think of shoveling poop, cleaning, which is a very big part of the job, of course, because animals always make messes, as do people. So animal husbandry is like the care of the animal and making sure that the animal's environment is healthy and safe. Animal training, which is working with the animal to essentially care for it using animal behavior techniques, and then education. So animal husbandry, I should warn you, there's a little bit of blood in this photo, but you can't see anything too gross, hopefully. This is a clouded leopard, and this is just an example of the kind of messes that they make. So, carnivores make different messes than herbivores, right? Herbivores eat plants, so they might, poop on the walls a lot more. Carnivores eat other animals, and so when they get their food, it's typically a little bloody, right? So animal husbandry included cleaning up a lot of messes that animals were making every day. But it also included animal health and making sure that all of our animals, all tarantulas or large leopards, were healthy. And so this is an example of just a day doing a cursory exam, or just kind of a general exam to make sure everyone was well. This is a Chilean rosehair tarantula that was getting I was taking her weight just to make sure she was a healthy weight, which she is, nice 23 grams, which is great for a tarantula. But sometimes that animal health work involved addressing issues when they came up. And so we had, for example, you can't really see him because he's wrapped in a towel, but on the left-hand side, there is a crow, an American crow who had sustained an injury. He got injured in the wild, on his leg, and it caused him some pain. And so he wasn't able to be released because he couldn't get around as well. But if we ever noticed that he was limping or was in pain, he would actually get acupuncture, which he really enjoyed, right? which was a shock to me. A bird getting acupuncture by itself is so bizarre, but it worked and he really enjoyed it. But yeah, so treating animals when there is a medical need for it and making sure that their health is stable on a regular basis. And occasionally that work also included raising baby animals. So when you're caring for animals in human care, sometimes if an animal gives birth in this, as is the case with human beings, sometimes if that mother gets sick and is unable to care for her baby, someone else has to step in. And in our case, it's the keepers. And so there were a few different animals that I had to help raise. This is a lesser anteater, or a tamandua, named Nina. This is the binturong that you saw. She's much bigger now. This is her when she was a baby. Her name is Willow. And then this is a small nocturnal mammal called a civet, which is also native to Asia. Excuse me. And these were three animals that I had the pleasure of participating in raising. And I will say, from the outside looking in, it maybe looks like a lot of fun, but it is a lot of work. I don't know if any of you have either had babies or have baby siblings. It's similar. They wake up in the middle of the night. You have to feed them around the clock. If they're nocturnal, they're most active at night. And so that can be a challenge. And then you have to take them home sometimes. So it was a lot of work, but it definitely was very rewarding. And this is one of my favorites. This is one of the sloths that I worked with. Her name is Fern. She's a two-toed sloth. And you can see on the left-hand picture, she's small. And on the right-hand picture, she's a lot bigger, just to show you just kind of how much they grow and how quickly they grow. This was over the course of several months. So moving on to animal training. So one of my favorite parts of taking care of animals is animal training. And when people think of animal training and they think of zoos, they might have like a distorted image in their mind of, like having a monkey jumping rope or something crazy, you know what I mean? Like having animals doing unnatural things. Well, in the case of accredited zoos and aquariums, animal training is done for the purpose of demonstrating natural behaviors and helping the animals participate in their own care. So this is the same clotted leopard that you saw before. And what you're seeing here is a behavior that's very simple. It's called target training. And so she's trained. She knows that if I point that stick somewhere and she touches her nose to it, she'll get a piece of treat, a piece of meat, which she likes. So she is rewarded for doing that behavior. And so we use this simple behavior to move this leopard around. So for example, if I need this animal to go from outside to inside so that I can clean one side or the other of her enclosure, or I need her to stand on a scale, for example, right? I can just use that to move her around versus trying to chase a leopard around, pick her up and move her where I need her to go, right? That would be dangerous and stressful for everyone. But if you can use animal training to simply ask her to move, and she has that choice and is rewarded, it's a stress-free, easy, safe way to engage with the animal. Animal training was also used, in addition for helping us take care of the animal, it was used for education programs. So again, natural behaviors that they already do. So in the case of the sloth, Fern, one of my coworkers built her kind of like this mobile perch that could be taken anywhere. It could be taken around the zoo. It could be taken into schools. And Fern was trained to climb onto that perch and climb around and kind of move to different parts of it when asked. And again, same as the leopard, in return, she would get yummy chunks of fruit or veggie that she really liked. So again, she has the choice to be able to do or not to do what she would like, and move around freely and get rewarded for it. So stress-free, and people are then able to see, wow, look how a sloth climbs. Look at a sloth's body, right? They're able to see more and experience more about that animal. And then finally, education, which I've already described is, something that I'm very passionate about. In the context of the zoo, education was a lot of fun because we got to do education programs with large numbers of people outside on zoo grounds. And so we would have crowds of like 600 people at a time, oftentimes in the summer, and we would fly birds, a lot of native birds like turkey vultures, like the one that you can see here. We would talk about species from around the world. People would be able to see these animals kind of using their natural behaviors in person, and just get a kind of a cool up close look at the diversity of wildlife found where they live and around the world. And so one of the things that was kind of continued to nag at me while I was a zookeeper was, man, right? Like I was working, thankfully, mostly with birds. But at the time, I knew that I wanted to go back to school. I knew I wanted to be able to study animals in their natural environments, and I wanted to focus on birds. And so after about 4 years of working as a zookeeper, I decided to go back to school to get my master's degree, and I went to Georgia Southern University in Statesboro, Georgia. And when I went to school, I studied seaside sparrows. And one thing that I want to note here, really every step of my career, I didn't know what I was doing when I entered that next step. When it came to animal care and that first internship that I got when I was 17 and going right into college, like I said, I had never been in a zoo and I was about to be an educator in a zoo. Like, how is that possible, right? But I learned as I went, and I watched and I kind of got skills and developed skills as I went. When I applied to graduate school, for example, and I'm willing to admit this, I did not know that Georgia, the state of Georgia, where I now live, I didn't know that Georgia had a coast, right? And I left Nashville, Tennessee, moved to coastal Georgia to study a sparrow that lives on the edge of the ocean. I didn't even know that Georgia touched the ocean, right? I had actually never even heard of this bird species before because they only live on coasts. And I'd never lived on a coast before. So despite the fact that there was a lot I didn't know, I still took that next step because I was passionate about it. And I knew that I wanted to do it. And that if you want to do it and you care enough and you're passionate, you will learn what you have to learn as you go. And that is what we're all doing, no matter how smart anyone wants you to think they are, okay? And we are smart, right? We are smart, and we are able to learn as we grow. So as I said, I went to grad school for a master's degree, studying this little brown bird called a seaside sparrow. And y'all, this was easily the most magical time of my entire life. I was in this ecosystem called a salt marsh, which is essentially a big grassy area, literally on the edge of the ocean. So you have salt marshes, you have beaches, these different kind of habitats that exist on the coast. And I was in the salt marsh. And if you're standing far away from the salt marsh, it kind of looks like just nothing but grass. Nothing's really going on out there. But when you get into it, it's muddy, it's hot, it's salty, and it is bursting with life. And so I was studying the nesting behavior of seaside sparrows. So I was trying to understand if there was a pattern to, for example, where seaside sparrows were putting their nests out there in the salt marsh, particularly as it relates to where the predators were. And so these are just a couple of images of seaside sparrows in their early stages of life. So the first one was them in the nest. This is a picture of them right after they fledge or leave the nest for the first time. They look extremely angry and unsettled, but that's just the face that they have. And the parents are feeding them while they're perched on the little blades of marsh grass. And then when they're an adult, they look like this, and they can do splits between blades of grass, which is really cool. But yeah, this is an adult seaside sparrow. And so I was wanting to understand, what the threat of nest predation or predators finding and eating the babies in the nest, which sounds brutal, but that's life in nature, right? I wanted to know, where is that happening? Where does it happen more often? Is it happening as you get closer to roads? Is it happening as you get closer to the water? Is there some sort of pattern to where nest predation threat is highest? And so that required me to spy on animals, which I love doing, thankfully. And spying is a strong word, but essentially it means that you're putting equipment out into the natural habitat, of animals to monitor them, to actually take pictures and videos of them so you can see what's going on without you actually having to physically be out there, because that can be pretty disruptive. And usually if animals see a human where there's not usually humans, like in a salt marsh, they're not going to behave how they normally do. So you don't want to kind of impact the surroundings. So in that case, you use remote sensing or things that are monitoring the environment while you're far away. If you think about the word remote, right? Like when you turn the TV on, the remote is called a remote because you can turn the TV on without going up to the TV and pressing on. So remote sensing means you are watching or monitoring wildlife from a distance, from far away. And so in this case, we had camera traps that take pictures of animals as they walk by the camera in the salt marsh. And we got all kinds of cool pictures of predators. And predators come in all shapes and sizes across the globe. And the same is true in our own backyards. The same is true in the salt marsh. There are things like rats, okay? Believe it or not, there's a rat that is native to salt marshes that live right there on the coast. They got the ocean view, okay? It's called a rice rat. We got several kind of hits on rice rats in the salt marsh. We saw species like American mink, which is related to ferrets. If you've ever seen, you know, the pet ferret, there are wild relatives of those called minks that live right here in Georgia and in the US. And then raccoons, right? And raccoons are, you know, while I wasn't surprised, it was kind of cool to see them out there because raccoons, they're technically like forest dwelling animals, but they're very versatile. They can make it work anywhere. And so we would see raccoons and their babies, as you can see in this picture, walking around in the salt marsh looking for a meal like crabs or bird eggs and things like that. So it was really cool to kind of get those images with those camera traps that I showed you a picture of a moment ago. We also used video cameras. So camera traps take pictures. Video cameras were there to take videos. And so I would put these video cameras on the nests to see what was happening when nest predation occurred, what species were actually finding and eating the babies while they were in the nest. And I've got some cool video footage from that I want to show you. Nothing is gruesome, but it's pretty cool. So, well, before I show you nest predation, this is just a video of, let me turn the sound off because I think I'm kind of excitedly squealing and I don't want you to hear that. This is a video of a baby in the nest. So this is like a 4 or 5 day old baby bird with its sibling egg who never hatched. But as you can see, that's what it kind of looks like when it's placed in the grass. It's really well camouflaged, very hard to find. And so not only is it hard to find, you know, it's camouflaged well so that predators don't find it, but that also means it's hard for me to find. So it took a lot of effort to find all the nests, but it made it very rewarding. So this is a video of nest predation. Okay, so just to orient you, this is a nest. That little white round thing there is an egg. This shiny piece here is not an egg, that's just a little monitor for temperature. So this is the only egg in the nest. And in just a second, look at that, boom. Said hi to the camera and then boop, took the egg out, just like that. And then I think in a couple seconds, it comes back to make sure that it didn't miss an egg and miss a meal as it was looking for food in that nest. Let's see. Yeah, I think it comes back in a second. But that animal, yep, there it is the American mink. So the image that I showed you before of the ferret relative. Oh, there he is. Nice view. That's the mink. And so they are really good. They're actually adapted to living in aquatic environments. And so they are good swimmers. They're good at moving around in salt marsh. It's a very wet, muddy environment. And as you can see, they eat bird eggs. So again, this is a better kind of photo of an American mink so you can have an idea. Cute predator. This was actually a really surprising one. This is not a mammal. This is actually a bird predator. You see it? And it is poking holes in the seaside sparrow egg. See that? Boom, boom. And it's actually taking sips of the yolk out of the seaside sparrow egg. So you can see it banging holes, right? Banging holes, killing that egg. But it does not stop there. So it takes a couple of drinks of the yolk of the seaside sparrow that's still in the egg. And then it will go a step further in just a second. So watch this. When I saw this video, my jaw dropped. Look at this. Picks up the egg. Pokes a few more holes just for good measure to make sure it's dead. picks it up, and then watch what it does. It literally throws it out of the nest. Throws it out of the nest, y'all. Listen, one of the things that I love so much about remote sensing and watching animals do their thing in their natural environment is that you get to just witness all kinds of interesting interactions and behaviors. And what this was, that small bird that you saw is called a marsh wren. Tiny, about half the size of a seaside sparrow, but they live in the exact same place. They nest in the exact same grasses. They eat the same thing as seaside sparrows. So they're in competition. And so marsh wrens are a lot more territorial or protective of their environment. And so if they find a seaside sparrow nest that has eggs in it, they will destroy that nest so that they have access kind of by themselves to the resources in that area, and they don't have to share it with other birds. And even though they're half the size of a seaside sparrow, they are a lot more aggressive. And so they typically will do that kind of behavior to make sure that they can kind of occupy the space by themselves. This behavior had been seen in other species of wrens. So Carolina wrens and house wrens that live right here in Atlanta, we've seen this behavior with them. But that had never been recorded in this particular kind of wren before. So this is the first time that this had been, at least on record, seen. And so when you see these kinds of interactions and it hasn't been recorded before, you can share that with the rest of the conservation community and say, hey, we now know that this happens in the salt marsh. The marsh wren is eating the eggs and throwing them out of the nest when it comes to seaside sparrows. And that expands our understanding of what's going on and what kind of threats the birds are facing. And the other really fun part of being in the salt marsh and just doing wildlife research in the wild was that I was there to kind of monitor a specific kind of, set of information. I was looking for seaside sparrows. I was looking for predators of seaside sparrows. But like, as you're walking around, you see whatever's out there. And on this particular day, I got to see a baby diamond-backed terrapin. And these are turtles that are native to Georgia. They are beautiful turtles. If you look at like the skin a little bit, it's like mottled and almost like marbly colored. And this one was a baby. So he was all, he had his little legs tucked in, trying to tuck his head in. And the salt marsh is like a nursery for a lot of animals. Birds nest out there, turtles nest out there, young fish will kind of find refuge in the salt marsh. So I was seeing all kinds of wildlife. And it really, coming from Philadelphia, I never thought I would get to see the things that I saw on Georgia's coast. So if you have the chance to even just visit Georgia's coast for fun, so not even for science or your career, just for fun, and you haven't been there before, I highly recommend it. It is one of the most beautiful places on the planet. And I mean that fully. And so, I got to witness, all kinds of life bursting at the seams out there in the salt marsh. And so this is what the turtle looked like in the mud. He was just kind of very hidden and camouflaged, which, is exactly how he should be, so he can hide from predators. But it was a really beautiful and moving experience. So now, kind of zooming ahead, I graduated with my master's almost 2 years ago now. And since then, I have kind of switched gears again, and I have been working in the realms of conservation science, policy, and community engagement. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, I work for an organization called the National Wildlife Federation, which is a national organization. They do a lot of different things in a lot of different parts of the country. And I traded in my muddy marsh boots and salt marsh grass for, a desk job, at the computer all day, which may sound boring, but I actually still very much enjoy it. And work in wildlife conservation takes a lot of different shapes. You have people who are taking care of animals hands-on in animal care facilities like zoos and aquariums, breeding endangered species for release into the wild, right? You have people who are out in the natural environment of animals, studying their natural behaviors, studying the environments that they live in, like I was doing in the salt marsh. And then you have people who may work more closely in policy and kind of behind the scenes work that kind of helps to drive and shape conservation that's happening on the ground. And so in my work at National Wildlife Federation in conservation science, I'm able to do a mix of three really important things, as I mentioned: science, policy, and community engagement. And the focus that I have as an overarching focus is really on equity and conservation. And so what do I mean by that? When I say equity, I mean that everyone has access, regardless of who they are or where they are, to conservation, the benefits of conservation, and participation in conservation. That means that if you are someone like me who came from a really low income background, right, and I couldn't really afford to work for free, you can still have access to the career readiness that you need. You can find paid internships. You can find opportunities that will pay you to get experience so that you can get a job when you graduate, right? Equity and conservation means that if I am investing resources, right, to make sure that the habitats of wildlife are suitable, they're healthy for wildlife, that I'm also thinking about the vulnerable people who are exposed to environmental threats, right? So the same dangers that face wildlife and that we have to address for them, like wildlife are threatened by pollution, by climate change, by habitat being kind of mowed over and built up with buildings, right? Those are threats that also hurt people. And more often than not, the people who are hurt the most tend to be Black people, Indigenous peoples, other communities of color, people who live in low-income environments, right? Like, we are the ones who bear the brunt of those environmental harms. And so when wildlife conservation is happening, even though it's called wildlife conservation, we live in the same place as wildlife. We share the same air, same water, same soil, same trees, same environments. And so whatever we do for wildlife to benefit wildlife also has to be done benefiting the people who are also most in danger and most harmed by environmental threats. So that was a long kind of description, but that's what I mean by equity and conservation. So when I approach science, whether it's going out and collecting data about wildlife and where they are, or it's crafting policy, right? Policy essentially means the laws that govern the decisions we make as people who live in the United States. So anything from laws against, how you can interact with other human beings, right? There are things you can't do that are illegal, right? That harm people. There are policies that tell us what we can and can't do to protect wildlife, right? Like, there are pollution limits so that we don't destroy our water systems, which has happened, unfortunately, in many places. And that's why those policies had to exist. There are laws that say, hey, if a species reaches this number, right? If they get too small, their population dwindles, we have to put a whole bunch of protections around them and make sure that we can bring them back so that they don't go extinct, right? And those laws are constantly being made. And so in policy advocacy, I had the opportunity to work a lot in Washington, D.C. to make sure that the policies that are being written about wildlife are making sure that communities like mine are benefiting from the money that's being made available to protect wildlife and the decisions that are made. But also that, legislation, once we have, say, a bill that we want to get passed and signed into law, we want to make sure it actually gets over the finish line and gets signed into law so we can protect wildlife and protect people. So that's what policy advocacy has really looked like for me. I also have worked a lot with public agencies. So every state has a state wildlife agency that is doing conservation on the ground, that is serving the residents of that state. And so working with them to ensure that they're engaging all people equally and ensuring that everyone reaps the benefits of conservation. And then community engagement and education, which again is one of my favorite things. And I actually used to work with Kiana in community engagement at Georgia Audubon, actually. And this is just a picture from back then. And conservation is not only the science, of course, of going out and studying wildlife or figuring out how to breed endangered animals. It's making sure that the everyday people, the general public who may not be conservation professionals, are aware of that work that's happening and part of that process. The thing about conservation is that it actually does take everybody's participation, not just scientists who got degrees in biology, not just people who work in wildlife policy, people who have backyards, people who live in cities, people who live in rural areas. We all have impacts on the environment that we live in, and we want to make sure that we are stewarding or taking care of the environments that we live in a way that is good for us and good for wildlife. And so community conservation and education is a great way to plug everybody into that work. And one of my favorite ways to do that is through birds. Again, I am obsessed with birds, and birds are everywhere. They're loud, they're beautiful, and it's a really great way to just kind of get people paying attention to the world around them. And so I'll end with this, just some pieces of advice, that, like the 3 main pieces of advice that I have come to realize over the course of the past, I guess, 10 years or so that I've been working in conservation. Number 1, it's really important to connect with people. Like I said, had I not had that chance encounter, literally, with the guy at my church whose sister worked at the zoo, I would have had no idea, first of all, the possibilities for somebody like me who was interested in wildlife since they were a kid, but really never saw themselves represented or knew what it took to be a wildlife expert, right? Had it not been for connecting with just that one person, I would not be here today, right? And so now more than ever, it is easier to connect with people who are doing what you think you might want to do. And so you have the internet, you have the internet's probably the most powerful tool, and social media and things like that, right? So if you see someone or if you search for someone who's doing the kind of work you want to do, reach out to them. I can tell you, and I can promise you that conservation professionals, especially those of us who did not come, who come from backgrounds where we didn't see a lot of people like us, we are very excited to share our story and share any advice we possibly can to help the next generation of young folks enter the field successfully and do what they need to do to get the jobs that they want. It also allows you to do number 2, which is to learn what you do like and what you don't like. A lot of careers in conservation and really across the board, no matter what field you're talking about, you might have one perception of what that career is, right? Like you see a doctor or you see a wildlife biologist and you're like, oh, that looks cool. But then when you get up close to it and you see what they do every day, it might turn out that you're like, this is actually the worst thing I've ever seen, and I do not want to do this, right? So it's good to get that knowledge about yourself and how you feel about that career before you like dedicate yourself to majoring in that, in pre-med science or conservation biology, right? And it just allows you to kind of get a better sense of what you like and what you don't like, so you can spend your time doing the thing that you enjoy. It'll also allow you to realize options that you didn't know were there, which is what happened with Miss Michelle at the zoo. Same thing. I thought that conservation science was maybe like 1 or 2 things that I had seen on TV. Conservation, wildlife conservation spans every discipline you can imagine. There are teachers, there are biologists who are out in the field, there are technologists, people who are developing technology to help advance and make conservation more successful. There are people who are lawyers, who are attorneys for wildlife policy and wildlife issues in that dimension. So there is room for everybody. Artists, there are people who do art for the purpose of communicating science about conservation or engaging the public, right? So no matter what your discipline or your actual interest is, there's a place for you in wildlife conservation and conservation science, which leads me to my last point about all of who you are is important to your work. So even if your interest isn't in studying animals, but it's in art and you like drawing and communicating through that medium, there is a place for you. In addition to the things you like to do, who you are is important to your work. And there was at some time, like when I first got into college, where I was really kind of not engaging my full identity in the work. I was just trying to fit in and not stand out as much as I possibly could. I was the only Black person, for example, in my entire major at my university, right? So I just wanted to kind of blend in and get the work done. But once I started doing the work, once I graduated, I realized, wait, my identity as a Black woman from Philadelphia, go Eagles, go Phillies, from an urban environment, who cares about justice, who cares about social justice, all these things about me are very important to the work that I do in wildlife science, in wildlife conservation. And so bring all of yourself to the work that you do, because it is needed. The perspectives that we all have uniquely because of our backgrounds, because of what we've seen, what we've done, what we've been through, what we've experienced, helps us to problem solve and to do as much as we can and be as creative as possible when we're solving big problems like the problems that are facing wildlife and people when it comes to our natural environment. And so with that, I will stop and I'll take any questions that folks might have.
Lovely. I'll wait for Kiana. There she goes.
Okay, I'm back.
So we have one question in the chat and we have one question in the Q&A. So I'll do the Q&A one. Sierra asks, do you have any recommendations for anyone looking to go back for a master's a few years after getting a bachelor's in a non-science field?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I also took 4 gap years between my undergrad and grad school. But my recommendation would be, so it depends on what specific kind of topic area you want to go to school for or what you want to study. But essentially what you want to do for grad school in the biological sciences or natural sciences, or specifically like with wildlife, you want to find someone who studies like an advisor first. So you look at it different from college when you kind of just apply to colleges that have the major you want. You actually need to find a professor at the college first who is an advisor for graduate students, to connect with them. Every advisor will be different. Some advisors in some disciplines will say, you know, you don't need experience in this field to be a member of my lab and for me to take you on as a student. So just come right on in. Some may, you know, say, hey, you need a year of experience doing some research out in the field. So you kind of get a sense of what's needed for every single different school and professor by connecting with them. And also that's just the process you have to take anyway. Usually for grad school, the professor will have to say, yes, I agree to support this student and to be their advisor when they apply to the school. And at that point you can apply. So I would, depending on your interests, I would look up professors who are studying what you want to study and start making contact with them to see what's required. And if you like birds, I will say there is a really cool website by the Wilson Ornithological Society that lists literally like, it's a super comprehensive list of like the people studying birds across the whole country. It's hundreds of people and it has a little blurb about what they study. That's how I found my school actually. So check out Wilson Ornithological Society if you're interested in birds in particular.
Awesome. And then we have a question in the Q&A in the chat. And Ashley asks, when you joined the National Wildlife Federation and started working with policy advocacy, did you learn the ropes on the job, or was there previous training to help you prepare for that?
That's a great question. And so just like every other step in my career, I learned when I got on the job. So I had literally no policy background actually, but I had a strong wildlife science and environmental justice background, which allowed me to apply that to whatever the context was. So there are a lot of ropes to be learned when it comes to policy, like that whole world, it's still so bizarre to me, right? Like getting senators to sign on as a co-sponsor for a bill, like that process alone it's like actually highly social. It's like meeting with them and telling them that they're excellent. Thank you so much for your work and advocacy, right? It's like very interpersonal. And so I didn't realize that it took all that, right? So people are spending all this time working on individual senators and individual representatives in the House, right, in Congress, to get them to say, okay, I'll vote yes when this bill comes up for a vote, or I'll co-sponsor this bill, right? And then you have the element of like garnering public attention to a bill, right? So, hey, we need you to reach out to your senators and say, we want you to vote yes on this, or we want you to vote no on this, right? Because they're supposed to represent the people in the state that they're from. And so they need to hear from their constituents to say, okay, what do they want? How do they want me to vote on this? And so, you know, gathering people to kind of share their opinion. And then there's the piece of actually like writing bills, right? I've never written a bill, but, you know, some of the work that I've done has been, all right, this particular senator wants to introduce a bill on wildlife disease. And so, or on whatever subject, right? And so we're having different people review this text, the stuff that we've written, and tell us if this sounds right. Like, does this make sense? Like, does this match the needs on the ground of wildlife and people, right? And so I've reviewed bills that were written to say, hey, can we add a provision to make sure that vulnerable communities are getting the resources that will be made available when this passes into law, right? So it literally, like, and to learn these ropes, I just sit in on meetings that I have no contribution to, but I just am learning. I'm listening to our policy experts, our attorneys talk about the processes, so I can kind of learn the ropes. So I you know, that does take extra time out of my day, but it has been an incredible learning opportunity for me. And so I always encourage people, just because you have not done something before, don't stop yourself from doing it just because it means you're learning on the job. So many people, most people, I will say, are learning on the job across disciplines. So Yeah, that's what it's been like for me. Thanks for asking.
Okay. Let's see. Liz says, do you have advice for finding paid internships in wildlife husbandry or conservation? Most of what I am finding in the Atlanta area are unpaid since they're nonprofits. I have an environmental science degree and not much experience with working with animals on hands-on.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And unfortunately, up until probably the last couple of years, there were maybe, particularly in the animal care field, like 2 zoos out of the almost 300 zoos and aquariums that exist that offer paid internships, which is absolutely terrible, right? Terrible. Now, because there have been a lot of conversations and advocacy around the fact that when you do that, people who can't afford to work for free can't become an animal care professional. Like that's ridiculous. And so now, by and large, a lot of these internships are still unpaid, but there are a lot more paid internships than there were before. I'm going to look for, so there's the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, AZA, hosts the job board for paid, jobs, paid full-time positions and internships. I'm going to put this in the chat. And this is for internships across the country. One thing I'll recommend or suggest if you're interested, a lot of people, most people actually do travel out of state for internships. So if you find an internship that is paid, but it's not in Atlanta, for example, and you are able to go, and sometimes they'll pay for that process for you to kind of relocate for the summer, I would say try it out, right? It can be kind of scary to move away from where you're from. I'm not sure how old you are, Liz, but if possible, I would give that a try. Another place to look, so that's for literally like zoos and aquariums, animal care. Another place to look is the Texas A&M job board.
They post everything.
Yes,
Everything
and so, yeah, usually those are all paid. So those are typically, I would say most of those aren't internships so much as they're like seasonal positions that essentially function like internships. It's like you work for the summer or the fall or the spring, and it's a limited time, they pay you, but it's usually research kind of out in the field. So it's, it ranges from everything from like being a field technician collecting data on bats, or you're out there, tagging mammals, or it's such a diverse kind of suite of jobs, and most of them are paid. And again, this job board, I'm getting the link right now, is also national in scope. It's hosted by Texas A&M, but it's not specific to Texas. There's the link. I would look at that. Again, those are mostly not animal care. It's mostly wildlife research out in the field, but they're seasonal, and it's a great way to kind of get your feet wet, say, I love this, or I really don't love this, and kind of get some clarity around how you want to take your future, what direction you want to take your future in. And Georgia Department of Natural Resources, that's Georgia's public wildlife agency. They actually have paid internships. Oh, I think they recently announced that they have paid internships. They also have seasonal positions. So I would look at Georgia Department of Natural Resources. They're not a nonprofit, so they get their funding from taxes and from state money, and tend to have a little more resources than some of the nonprofits in the area. So I would check out Georgia Department of Natural Resources. I'll see if I can find that in the chat.
I would add, Liz, since I think that was Liz, yeah. Since you said Atlanta, I'm assuming you're in Georgia as well. Checking Warnell is UGA's School of Forestry and Natural Resources. Their job postings to do the same thing that Texas A&M offers. So finding those like seasonal, they're usually paid, and you can help somebody with research, which is what I did the summer after I graduated. So I got to do bird banding. It was fun. I found out that I don't like to do research, but the bird banding part was great for like hands-on experience. Got to see a lot of birds, got to hold and like learn how to handle and measure. So that can give you some more of that hands-on experience that you can later turn into something else, as far as like husbandry and things. But cool. We don't have any more questions in the Q&A.
I actually have a question for Corina. Mm-hmm. So just to wrap up, I remember when you mentioned your advice that you would give you said go out and talk to people, but I know, especially like if you're in high school or middle school, sometimes talking to people that you don't know can be a little bit intimidating. And so my question is, what advice would you offer about starting that conversation? Like, what would you say?
That is a great question, Kiana. So if you're in middle school, so if you're a minor, I would actually recommend, and I guess you can be a minor in high school too. I would recommend having an adult part of that conversation. So if you have a parent or guardian or relative or trusted adult that can kind of facilitate that connection with a professional that you've identified, I would actually recommend using social media to find people. So even if you don't, I'm not necessarily saying to slide into someone's DMs, unless you're old enough and you feel comfortable with that, you know, it could be hit or miss, but you can at least find people. So I still, for years now, I will on Instagram look up hashtag Black biologist or Black ornithologist or Black, you know, like for my own personal kind of representation and to see kind of who's out there. And I mean, I still find new people. You find hundreds of people who are professionals in all kinds of fields. Same for Twitter. You know, you can find people using social media, and typically people will link to their like websites or like the way to officially contact them or reach out to them. And so if you are in high school or middle school, I would recommend having your parent, you know, you find that contact information for them and ask your parent to reach out. That has happened to me many, many times. So I have parents of middle schoolers or high schoolers send me an email and say, hey, can we have like a 20-minute, you know, Zoom conversation so my kid can learn more about what you do, what it took, et cetera. And it's excellent. Like I said, I love doing that. So many of us are so happy to offer that to folks who are interested. So bring your parents or adults that are in your life into the process to make sure that you feel comfortable. But you can find those people using very popular and easy to access social media sites.
And if there's,
Thank you.
that reminded me of you working for the zoo, Corina. I remember if there's say someone who wants to work for the zoo, but you don't have an in or a plug or anything like that. I remember I just emailed like 2 people from the contact list on the Chattanooga Zoo website. And I was like, hey, I'm interested in doing this. And they got back to me. I think people in the field really like to hear from younger people that want to do what they do. And so, yeah, definitely reaching out, sending an email, it always helps.
Absolutely agree.
Awesome. Are there any more questions for Corina before we wrap up here? Not seeing any in the Q&A and the chat. So if that is all, I want to thank you so much, Corina, for joining us today. I already know so much about you, and it's so amazing to hear your story. So thank you for joining us. And if you have any questions for Corina after this program, please be sure to email myself or Sheridan, and we'll be sure to send those over to her. Everyone should be receiving a recording within a week of today of this presentation. And we look forward to seeing you join us for our next presentation, which is on June 15th with Hannah Palmer with Finding the Flint. So we're very much looking forward to that. Thank you again, Corina, for joining us. And we hope that everyone learned something today.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.